They thought they could buy me. They thought they could buy Africa. But they were wrong. My friends, what would you do if the dignity of your entire nation, your entire continent, was placed on the auction block? If a foreign power walked into your house and put billions of dollars on the table, not to help your people, but to buy your silence, your obedience, your very soul. That is exactly what happened in Burkina Faso. 3 weeks ago, as I sat in my office in Ouagadougou, I was handed a sealed diplomatic envelope. Inside was a letter that shook me to the core not because of its generosity, but because of its arrogance. The government of Benjamin Netanyahu was offering more money than our nation's entire yearly budget. They called it aid. But let me be clear, it was not aid. It was a bribe. A bribe to keep me from criticizing Israel's policies toward Palestine. A bribe to convince other African leaders to look away. A bribe to protect their vast business operations across our continent. Think about that for a moment. They believed Africa has a price tag. That with enough zeros on a check we would forget the suffering of others, betray our principles, and sell out our people. They believed our dignity was just another commodity to be bargained with. But let me ask you, the viewers, can you put a price on freedom? Can you put a price on the dignity of a continent that has endured centuries of exploitation? In the next few minutes, I will share exactly what happened after that letter arrived, what I did, how the world reacted, and why this single moment sparked a movement now spreading across Africa. Stay with me, because this is not just a story about Burkina Faso. It is a story about sovereignty, about truth, and about the awakening of a generation. And before we begin, if you believe that Africa's dignity is not for sale, please share this video. And if you believe that the truth matters more than headlines, subscribe to join us in this journey. The story began quietly with an ordinary afternoon in Ouagadougou. President Ibrahim Traoré was reviewing security reports when an aide handed him a sealed diplomatic envelope. Marked confidential, it carried the kind of weight that usually signaled sensitive discussions between states. But inside, he found something that did not belong to the world of diplomacy, it belonged to the world of corruption. The letter was from the government of Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. It contained a proposal so audacious that it made his blood boil. Israel was offering Burkina Faso $1.2 billion more money than the entire annual budget of the country. At first glance, some might have thought it was foreign aid, but when read carefully, it became clear this was not assistance. It was a bribe. The conditions were explicit. Traoré was asked to stop criticizing Israel's policies toward Palestine, to soften his voice in the African Union, and to convince other African leaders to fall silent as well. In essence, he was being asked to betray his principles and his people in exchange for money. But it didn't stop there. The letter also revealed another layer of desperation. Israel was deeply worried about its business operations spread across Africa. To protect those economic networks, they promised a few extra billions if Traoré agreed not to shut them down. Think about what that meant. A foreign government was attempting to buy not just the silence of one man, but the silence of an entire continent. They believed that if they could muzzle the leader of Burkina Faso, others would fall in line. They believed that the dream of African sovereignty could be priced, packaged, and sold. For Traoré, this was personal. He did not risk his life in a revolution to replace one corrupt regime with another. He did not take power to become a puppet dancing for foreign interests. The young captain who rose to lead his nation had made a promise: no more foreign exploitation disguised as partnership, no more deals that sold out the dignity of the Burkinabe people. This letter was not just a diplomatic misstep, it was a test of whether he truly meant those words. The pressure was immense. Intermediaries from neighboring countries, so-called friendly advisors, approached him. They painted seductive pictures: new hospitals, modern infrastructure, advanced weapons for the army. They framed it as an opportunity to turn Burkina Faso into a regional powerhouse. But each conversation ended with the same subtle condition: tone down your anti-Israel rhetoric. It became clear that this was not an isolated offer. It was a coordinated campaign. They had been studying him, building a profile of his needs, and calculating what price might tempt him to compromise. What they failed to calculate was his conviction. Instead of quietly discarding the letter or hiding it away, Traoré chose the path no one expected. He called a press conference. In front of live cameras, journalists, and the entire world, he unfolded the letter and read it word for word. He exposed the bribe, publicly holding the paper up for all to see. The room fell silent. For decades, African leaders had been accused of being bought, but never before had one revealed the evidence himself. This was not speculation, not rumor, not accusation. It was proof. A foreign government had attempted to purchase African dignity, and a leader had said no. That act transformed the entire narrative. No longer was this about one country or one letter. It became a continental turning point, a declaration that Africa's sovereignty could no longer be treated as a commodity. Within hours, the phrase Africa is not for sale spread across 14 nations. At that moment, Traoré had taken what was meant to be a private arrangement and turned it into a weapon of truth. And for the first time in a long time, Africa felt united by a single voice saying, enough. The moment Ibrahim Traoré unfolded that letter on live television, history pivoted. Cameras zoomed in on his steady hands as he read every word, his voice sharp, unflinching. This is not aid. This is a bribe. With that sentence, he detonated a political earthquake. For the first time, a sitting African head of state exposed in real time a foreign government's attempt to buy silence. The silence in the press room was electric. Journalists who had covered African politics for decades sat stunned, their pens frozen in midair. Many had grown used to half-truths, denials, and vague accusations. But here was something unprecedented, a president risking his career, his alliances, even his safety, to show the world what powerful nations whisper behind closed doors. The immediate fallout in Tel Aviv was panic. Netanyahu, according to Israeli insiders, exploded in fury. He accused Traoré of turning a private agreement into a weapon. But what Israel saw as betrayal, Africans saw as liberation. For decades, their continent had been treated like a marketplace, their leaders like employees. Now that perception was being shattered on global television. Within hours, reactions rippled across Africa. Mali, one of Burkina Faso's closest allies, announced it would review every contract signed with Israeli companies. Niger, still rebuilding its sovereignty, recalled its ambassador from Tel Aviv. Chad, often careful in its diplomacy, froze its talks with Israel. And Ghana, long considered a cautious middle-of-the-road actor, did the unthinkable. It publicly supported Burkina Faso's stand. The reaction from South Africa was even more symbolic. Its leaders called Traoré's move a masterclass in dignified leadership, drawing a direct link between his defiance and the legacy of Nelson Mandela. For South Africans, it was a reminder of their own fight against a system that once treated dignity as negotiable. But the real shockwave came from Africa's youth. In Senegal, students painted murals of Traoré holding up the infamous letter with the bold caption, "Africa is not for sale." In Kenya, young activists launched online campaigns demanding their government disclose the terms of all foreign aid. In Nigeria, university campuses erupted in debates with thousands of students demanding transparency from their leaders. The momentum was not just political, it was generational. They called themselves the uncompromised generation. These young men and women weren't just applauding Traoré. They were declaring that his act of defiance belonged to them too. They demanded accountability in every foreign deal, transparency in every agreement, and dignity in every international relationship. What began as a single press conference in Ouagadougou was turning into a continental awakening. Internationally, the responses revealed deeper truths. French diplomats scrambled to calculate what this meant for their own influence in West Africa. American officials quietly reached out not to condemn Traoré, but to assess whether this was an isolated act or the birth of a larger movement. Meanwhile, China, ever the silent observer, said nothing, but their silence spoke volumes. Unlike the West, they understood that Africa's new leadership demanded respect, not manipulation. On the streets of Ouagadougou, the atmosphere was electric. Thousands gathered outside government buildings, chanting slogans of solidarity. Mothers, fathers, children, they all felt that this was no longer just about politics. It was about dignity. It was about finally hearing a leader speak the words they had been waiting to hear for generations. We cannot be bought. For Israel, the revelation was more than a diplomatic embarrassment. It was a strategic nightmare. What had been meant as a private arrangement to protect its economic networks was now front-page news across Africa. Every contract, every deal, every alliance it had forged on the continent suddenly faced scrutiny. For Africa, it was the opposite. For the first time in decades, a leader had taken billions in potential aid and rejected it publicly, proudly, without hesitation. That act didn't just expose a letter, it lit a fire. And that fire was spreading fast across borders, across generations, across the very foundations of Africa's relationship with the world. When the dust settled after the press conference, Burkina Faso, and indeed Africa, was no longer the same. The letter that was meant to silence had instead become a mirror, reflecting back the decades of exploitation Africans had endured. Its consequences rippled through every level of society, both civil and political. In Ouagadougou, ordinary citizens felt a surge of pride. Men and women who had long believed politics was a game played far above their heads suddenly saw proof that their leader was willing to reject billions in order to defend their dignity. Markets buzzed with conversations, and street vendors replayed clips of Traoré's words on their radios. People began to believe that sovereignty wasn't just rhetoric, it was possible. Civil society responded with urgency. Lawyers, academics, and community leaders began organizing forums to discuss the meaning of transparency and accountability in foreign partnerships. For the first time, activists were not dismissed as dreamers. They now had a concrete example to point to, a leader who had demonstrated that foreign aid with strings attached was nothing more than disguised control. NGOs launched campaigns demanding audits of existing contracts with foreign companies, insisting that the people had a right to know the terms of every deal signed in their name. The youth, however, carried the momentum to another level. From Dakar to Nairobi, they demanded action, not just words. In Bobo Dioulasso, Traoré addressed a packed auditorium of students telling them, "We trade with each other first, the world second." That declaration set off a frenzy of grassroots initiatives. Young entrepreneurs began drafting plans for African-owned banks, technology hubs, and manufacturing collectives. Suddenly, independence was not just about flags and anthems. It was about building factories, creating jobs, and stopping the endless export of raw materials that left Africa dependent on outsiders. Politically, the shockwaves were immense. Within Burkina Faso's own government, ministers, who had once quietly advocated for foreign assistance, began rethinking their positions. Some were afraid, what if aid was cut? What if sanctions followed? But Traoré was unyielding. Any aid that comes with strings attached is not aid. It is control. His firmness forced the cabinet to align behind a new doctrine of uncompromising sovereignty. Beyond Burkina Faso, other African leaders faced pressure at home. Citizens began asking, if Traoré can say no, why can't you? Leaders who had grown comfortable with opaque deals suddenly found themselves under the microscope. Parliaments were forced to debate contracts once buried in secrecy. Opposition parties gained momentum by demanding that their governments match Burkina Faso's stance. The private sector, too, was shaken. At first, panic spread through international companies with heavy investments in Africa. Stock prices of mining corporations and agricultural exporters tumbled as investors worried about instability. But soon an adjustment began. The smarter companies realized the message was not anti-business, it was anti-exploitation. Those willing to pay fair wages, respect environmental standards, and invest in local communities began renegotiating contracts. A new model of partnership was being born, one based not on plunder, but on equality. In the wider political sphere, a new standard had been set. No longer could foreign governments assume that African leaders would quietly pocket their offers. Every attempt to manipulate now risked public exposure. Every shady deal could be turned into tomorrow's headline. In effect, Traoré had weaponized transparency, and that single act changed the cost of corruption forever. For the people, the message was clear: dignity had no price. For the political class, the lesson was harsher: betray your people, and you will be held accountable. The bribe meant to buy silence had instead purchased a revolution of expectations. Outside Africa, the world reacted with a mixture of disbelief, fear, and quiet respect. In Washington, officials avoided public comment, but behind closed doors, the questions were serious. Was this just Traoré acting alone, or was it the beginning of a continental shift? American diplomats, long accustomed to African leaders bending under pressure, realized that a dangerous precedent had been set. If one small nation could expose a bribe so boldly, others might follow, and that would threaten decades of carefully managed influence. In Paris, the reaction bordered on panic. French corporations, already under fire for their exploitative practices in West Africa, feared that their contracts would be the next target of scrutiny. French diplomats scrambled to reassure allies and to distance themselves from Israel's blunder, but the damage was already done. France had spent years trying to maintain a grip on its former colonies, and Traoré's defiance only fueled a growing anti-colonial sentiment. Tel Aviv was in full crisis mode. Netanyahu's government faced not only embarrassment, but the real prospect of losing billions in African markets. What was intended as a discreet transaction had turned into a continental scandal. Israeli business networks, once secure and invisible, now found themselves the subject of investigations, protests, and public outrage across multiple African states. Beijing, by contrast, remained silent, but silence can speak louder than words. Chinese observers understood the significance of the moment. Unlike the West, which often relied on coercion or conditional aid, China had built its African relationships on a narrative of mutual respect and infrastructure investment. To them, Traoré's defiance validated a strategy they had been pursuing for decades. If you treat Africa as an equal partner, not a pawn, you gain loyalty that money alone can't buy. Even in global markets, the effects were felt. For a brief period, stock prices of companies heavily invested in Africa wavered as investors feared instability. But as the dust settled, a new calculation emerged: transparency, though disruptive, actually reduced risk. Corruption created volatility. Open and fair agreements promised predictability. The irony was striking: what the West feared as instability was in fact a foundation for long-term stability. Meanwhile, the media across Europe and North America struggled to spin the story. Headlines framed it as "Traoré escalates tensions" or "Burkina Faso risks isolation." Yet their audiences could see the truth: a young African leader had rejected billions and dared to say no. In living rooms from New York to London, ordinary citizens began to ask uncomfortable questions. If Africa can demand dignity, why has the world denied it for so long? The global message was unmistakable. The old playbook of secret deals and purchased silence was finished. Any government or corporation approaching Africa now faced a new reality: treat the continent with respect or risk public exposure. My friends, what began as a single letter has now become a continental awakening. They wanted to buy one man's silence, but instead they awakened the voices of millions. They believed dignity had a price tag, but Africa has proven that its soul is not for sale. This was never just about Burkina Faso or even Israel. It was about the centuries-old question of whether Africa would forever remain a marketplace for others or finally rise as a sovereign force of its own. The warning is clear. Any leader who accepts bribes, who signs away resources, who compromises dignity for temporary comfort will answer to the people of this continent. Every deal is now under the microscope. Every handshake in a closed room could be exposed on live television tomorrow. And every attempt to manipulate Africa only accelerates the unification of its people. But the story does not end here. The test has only begun. Economic retaliation, diplomatic pressure, and covert interference will come. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Ghana, South Africa, these nations will be challenged, tempted, threatened. The real question is whether this generation of Africans, the uncompromised generation, can hold the line. Because sovereignty is not won once. It must be defended every day. And yet there is hope born from unity, from the courage of young Africans who are building businesses, coding software, creating art, and demanding governments that serve their people, not foreign masters. This hope is more powerful than any check written in a foreign capital. It is the seed of a future where Africa defines itself on its own terms. So I ask you, especially those watching from America and beyond, do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's reform strategies are truly effective, or should Africa prepare for another leader to carry this mission forward? Can we continue to trust that his vision of dignity and sovereignty will survive the storms ahead? If you believe that Africa's dignity has no price, please share this message. Share it so the world knows you stand on the side of truth. And if you believe that headlines may fade, but justice must endure, subscribe and stay with us. Because this is only the beginning. Africa is rising. Burkina Faso is leading. And together we declare, never again will our continent be sold.